Amanda, shall we start?
Okay, sounds good. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's MEST Center webinar. Before we get started, be sure to take a look at the guidelines I sent in the chat feature. During this webinar, if any questions should arise about the presentation, please message me, Amanda Mosgrip, using that chat feature. It's located at the bottom of the screen, and they will be answered at the end of the presentation. And now I will hand it off to the MEST Center co-director, Dr. Walid Khalil, who will introduce our speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Amanda. Good morning or good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our webinar for today. Today, we are very pleased to have with us Professor Uzger Sinanoglu, who is a professor of electrical and computer engineering at NYU Abu Dhabi. He obtained his master's and PhD in computer science engineering from University of California, San Diego in 2001 and 2004, respectively. He has industry experience working for TI, IBM, and Qualcomm, and has been with NYU Abu Dhabi since 2010. During his PhD, he won the IBM PhD Fellowship Award twice. He's also the recipient of the Best Paper Awards at the IEEE VLSI Test Symposium in 2011 and the ACM Conference on Computer Communication Security in 2013. Professor Sinanoglu research interests include design for test, design for security, and design for trust for VLSI circuits. WIR has around 200 conference and journal papers and 20 issued and pending patents. He has given more than a dozen tutorials on hardware security and trust in leading CAD and test conferences, such as the DAC, DATE, ITC, etc. He served as a track and topic chair or technical program committee member in roughly 15 conferences and a guest associate editor for many other journals, including the IEEE TIFS and TCAD. He's the director of the Center for Cybersecurity at NYU Abu Dhabi, and his recent research in hardware security and trust is being funded by the US NSF, the US Department of Defense, SRC, Intel, and Mubadala Technology. We're very pleased to have him today to present his work. Thank you, Doctor, and I'll give you the floor.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Walid. And I also would like to thank the directors of the center, especially Mark Tehranipur, for inviting me to give a talk. I recall 10 years ago, around this time, I gave another invited talk for Mark, and that was back in Connecticut. So I expect another invited talk invitation in 2030 from Mark. So anyhow, and I also would like to thank Amanda for the logistical support. Let me start my talk slowly. So this is going to be about logic locking. It's a technique that is used to protect integrated circuits or chips. And what I'll try to do in this talk, it's a short talk, but I'll do my best to summarize this research field, which is basically a little over a decade old. And I'll talk about lessons learned, I'll talk about metrics, and I'll talk about the trade-offs for implementing logic locking on chips. And let me also acknowledge our sponsors, in particular DARPA, who is currently sponsoring our research in logic locking. So I organized this talk in two parts. The first part is going to be high-level introductory material about logic locking. So I'll talk about the big problem, the security threats for integrated circuits and the need for such techniques. Then I'll introduce logic locking, and I'll summarize the lesson learned and trade-offs in this domain. This is going to be like a very short summary of this reference book that came out very recently. So in case anybody wants to learn more, they could always take a look at that book. And then in part two, I will go deeper into logic locking and see what the most recent efforts are. So as we all know, today, chip design is no longer a centralized process where the chip design companies handle everything. That used to be the case maybe 20, 30 years ago, but today once the chip is designed, it goes through some steps that are outsourced to other companies in other countries and continents. Fabrication, test, in particular, are critical steps that are outsourced. So as a result, chip design companies, yes, they use the CAD software, a software suite from major CAD companies to produce this GDS2, which is the layout files that represent the designs. But this GDS2 files, these layout files, are unprotected or naked in the sense that everything is out in the open. So all the design details, implementation details, everything is available for whoever is analyzing these GDS2 files. And then this naked GDS2 files, where the design IP is unprotected, goes through this untrusted stages in the manufacturing flow. In particular, the fabrication, in particular, testing, which can be also outsourced to OSAT companies. And finally, the chips come out from this process, and they're sent out to applications in field. And then during these uncontrolled stages, the chip design company has no control over the supply chain. And as a result, the chips can be tampered with during fabrication. The chips can be overbuilt by the fab. The only thing that the chip design company is relying on is a legal contract with the fab, but the fab can actually produce more than contracted number of chips, and they can actually sell them in aftermarket. So we call this the overbuilding problem. And this is an end result of the fact that the chip design company has no idea, technologically, no idea what's happening in these uncontrolled stages. So these two problems, namely the chip implementation, meaning the layout files, the GDS2 files revealing design details, and the designers having no control over the chip supply chain, has various implications. And we've been hearing stories that I'm not going to get into details of. There have been IP theft issues, design IP theft issues, there have been counterfeiting problems, there have been overbuilding issues. And these issues are end results of these two fundamental problems. So logic locking is a technique that can address these two fundamental problems. So logic locking is yet another CAD tool to be added to the software tools provided by, let's say, EDA vendors. So if the designers use logic locking, what they will end up with is a GDS2 that is no longer so-called naked. I keep calling it naked, meaning the details are not out in the open. So there is some protection in place because some hardware has been added to the design. And this added hardware are controlled by some secret key bits that create some confusion, some obfuscation for whoever is analyzing the GDS2 design details. And it is this protected IP that goes through now the uncontrolled stages of fabrication and testing. And at the end of this, so the first problem is now addressed because we're no longer sending this design details unprotected. And at the end of this process, every chip that comes out is locked when they're first manufactured. So they don't work until somebody actually loads that key information on the memory of every single fabricated chip, which means that every one of these chips need to go through this step, which says trusted facility next to it. This is a facility that the design house trusts for activating these chips by loading the key on the memory of every single chip. This gives the design house a way to close the loop and account for every single chip that is fabricated, because if a chip does not go through this stage, it simply does not work. It's not functional. So with this step, the chips are unlocked. And now with this step, the designers have control over the supply chain. So what is this logic locking then? What kind of hardware do we add into the designs? So this is a very simple example, trivial example, where a bunch of gates in red are added into the design, controlled by some bits, some unknown key bits, 1, 2, and 3. So this is an example of a locked design, locked with 3 key bits. And then the correct values for these 3 bits need to be loaded in the memory of this chip to be able to make this chip functional. Until then, the chip is not functional, it's not working. And this is a one-time operation, and this key information needs to be written one time into a non-volatile memory, preferably a tamper-proof memory. And this way now, the wrong, if somebody loads a wrong key on the chip fails. This way, the design house can control the supply chain. And also, the correct value of this key combination, only one of the 8 combinations make this chip work. So this means that if the key values are unknown, so is the functionality. So the key dictates the functionality. By hiding the key, you're effectively hiding the details of your IP, hiding the functionality of your chip. So reverse engineering, you're getting protection against reverse engineering and piracy as well as a result. Obviously, everything relies on the key. So the functionality, you hide the functionality based on it, you control the supply chain based on it. So you need to make sure that you basically hide this key. Just to illustrate the basic idea, again, this is the same locked circuit. This is the original version before locking. So correct key happens to be 110. So if 110 is in place, then 000 correctly produces a 0, just like in the original circuit. But if somebody enters a wrong key vector they load something wrong into the tamper-proof memory, then 000 produces a wrong value of 1. We call that the output is corrupted in this particular case. For this particular input pattern, this output is corrupted because there's a wrong key in place. So incorrect keys are to produce incorrect outputs in logic locking. And as I said, only the chip designer or the IP owner is supposed to know the secret key, and they should hide this from everybody else. So in a nutshell, we're doing some password protection at the hardware level. That's what logic locking is. And whenever we say attacks on logic locking, we really mean that somebody is trying to steal or retrieve this logic locking key, because once they do, then the defense is collapsed. So how can attacks actually go after the key? We defined this threat model about 8 years ago, where we assume that the attacker has 2 pieces of information. One is the GDS2 files, the layout files. This is just like the files that you send to the fabrication facility, from which somebody can do reverse engineering and obtain the details of the netlist. So the attacker, we assume that they see the details, the gates, they can figure out these are the key bits, they're controlling these added gates. But what they don't know are these key bit values. So is it 000 or 111? The attacker doesn't know and wants to figure out. The other tool that the attacker has is this functional chip that the attacker could have obtained from the market. So this chip has been already activated by loading a key on it, and it was somewhere used in application somewhere, and then the attacker gets a hold of it. And now the attacker can query this chip, apply inputs, get outputs, and with that information and with this information, they try to figure out what the key is. So this chip is referred to as an oracle from the attacker's point of view. And we proposed an attack 8 years ago called sensitization attack. And a famous attack, SAT attack, was proposed back in 2015 with the same threat model as well. So logic locking, having this threat model in mind, logic locking has 2 main objectives. One, it has to be effective, meaning if somebody loads an incorrect key to a chip, that chip should fail, and it should fail badly. So in other words, it shouldn't fail just once in a while for 1 out of 1 million cases. It should really fail most of the time to a point where the chip is not usable. We call this output corruption, and I call this objective effectiveness of logic locking. The second objective is that the logic locking defense should be resilient against the attacks that I just showed. So we call this defense strength, because if it's not strong, then somebody can steal the key and the whole defense is gone. So the logic locking should meet both objectives to be a meaningful defense for IP protection. And since 2008, which is when the first logic locking solution came out in a date paper, there has been quite a bit of research. And in this picture, I tried to capture the most significant ones, but it's by no means complete because I can't fit everything here, so I apologize. But The earlier logic locking solutions focused on output corruption. So how do you do logic locking to get a lot of output corruption? And then later on in 2012, we wrote a paper, we showed the threat model and the first attack on logic locking. And in 2015, a more serious version of that attack came out, breaking all these logic locking defenses. And from that point on, people responded by coming up with logic locking defenses, basically protecting against these kind of attacks. And then new attacks came targeting these defenses and so on. So it has been a cat and mouse game since then. And as I said, this is by no means complete. But there have been a lot of defenses and a lot of attacks. And my research team, for example, we've been on both sides of the game. We've come up with defenses. We've come up with attacks as well on logic locking. We actually came up with a couple of chip prototypes. We designed and fabricated chips that have logic locking defense in them. So let me also talk about how these oracle-based attacks work. So meaning in this strong threat model where the attacker has the chip as well as the locked netlist, how does the attacker use this information to figure out the key? In this huge key space, all possible values of the key, how can the attack find this correct key, which is one of millions of possibilities? The attacker uses simulations on this netlist, obviously by using a computer. And from these simulations, the attacker finds out a good crafted input pattern to apply to a working chip that is already active, that has been already activated with a key to get the output pattern. And then from this input-output pattern pair, the attacker basically takes this information and feeds it back into his simulations to understand which keys still explain this behavior and which keys don't explain this behavior. So after every time the attacker does this, a bunch of keys are eliminated from the key search space. And this is repeated iteratively. And at the end, the attack converges on one key vector that explains all the input-output patterns that this functional chip produces. And that's basically identified as the correct key. So a SAT solver is used in this famous SAT attack, for example, for this reason. And one thing we've learned in our research is that the more output corruption there is, and that's what I said as a good thing to have in logic locking defenses, the more output corruption we have, the easier these attacks are basically successful in finding the correct key. So these are kind of, so the two objectives that I talked about end up being kind of contradictory objectives. There are also oracle-less attacks, meaning attacks that just look at the connectivity of a netlist and looking for certain structures to figure out, okay, if these are the connections between the gates, then these must be the values of the correct key, or this must be the functionality of the design. So these attacks just work on a locked netlist without having to query an oracle. And in the process, they look at connectivity, they look at signal probabilities and all that to find out the key. So in the 10 plus years, like 12 to be exact, years of research in logic locking, the community found out that, you know, the more output corruption there is, the easier these schemes are broken, the less resilient they are to especially oracle-based attacks. That's lesson number one. Lesson number two, if you implement the locking circuitry kind of in an isolated manner, kind of isolated from the rest of the circuit, then somebody can actually find out its boundaries and then remove it from the locked netlist. So it's kind of a very useless defense. And in all honesty, we had some defenses broken this way. And hard coding the secret key as part of the netlist is always a bad idea. You should never rely on synthesis tools to make it disappear, because some traces are left. If you hard code the secret key, some traces are left for the attacks to exploit. Again, one of our defenses got broken because of this bad implementation practice. And finally, I think the most important trade-off, the most important takeaway point is there's these two objectives that I mentioned, output corruption and resilience against logic locking attacks, are two contradictory objectives. To get good resilience, you need to compromise, you need to give up on output corruption, which means your logic locking defense ends up being not so effective. And so this is kind of an unpleasant trade-off game that you end up playing. And most recent logic locking defenses in the literature ended up playing this game, this trade-off between effectiveness versus resilience. And let me try to get a little more detail on this one. So this is basically the original insecure flow. You know, the original netlist, original design goes through fabrication, and whoever reverse engineers this chip gets the original implementation details back. So that's why I call this insecure flow. But you do logic locking and you produce a locked chip. Then, because this is different than the original design details, you are kind of getting some sort of a resilience against reverse engineering. Of course, to basically get the original functionality back, you must have some sort of a restore circuitry driven by the correct key, and only then you produce the original functionality. And this way you get resilience against reverse engineering. And a little more detailed look at that picture. This is your original function, and this is your modified function with some generic restored circuitry. Only when driven by the correct key produces the original functionality back. Now, because this is the implementation of this is different than the original function implementation, you're getting resilience against reverse engineering. And because nobody knows the value of this key, they can't find out what this implements. Now, the big question is, how similar or how different do you want these two to have? So how different do you want original function to be the modified function? And how do you quantify this? And how do you connect this to our objectives of effectiveness versus defense strength? And we introduced this metric called error rate. This error rate refers to the number of input patterns for which the two implementations produce different outputs. For how many input patterns do they give you different values, right? So error rate is that metric. If you have a low error rate, then you are actually resilient to all the Oracle-based attacks, because the Oracles learn only a little in every iteration. But at the same time, your logic locking defense is not that effective because the chip fails only once in a full moon. On the other hand, if you have a high error rate, then it's really effective. You know, if somebody puts in an incorrect key, the chip fails most of the time, but then you're vulnerable to Oracle-based attacks. And this is what I meant by the unpleasant trade-off. It's really, it ends up being one or the other. You either get effectiveness or get defense strength or resilience. And again, I tried to put a table that is somewhat representative, but it doesn't show many of the attacks out there. It doesn't show many of the defenses out there, but it just gives you an idea that the early solutions in the literature are really ones that give you great output corruption. So they're really effective logic locking solutions, but they are vulnerable to these attacks. And on the other hand, the later solutions over here are resilient to these Oracle-based attacks simply because the output corruption is very low, so they're barely effective. And then the minute you say, well, let me have a two-layer defense, let's pick one from here and one from here so that we combine the best of both worlds. It really doesn't work that way, because there are also attacks that have been proposed, like AppSat and Double Dip, to peel off one defense, which is the one that gives you a lot of output corruption, and then you're left with your ineffective logic locking defense. So this trade-off game is truly unpleasant for logic locking. So what to do about it? The next question we ask ourselves is, how can we snap out of this trade-off, right? And the answer is basically we need to do something about this Oracle, because this Oracle learns so much from output corruption that we end up having to limit our output corruption and make our logic locking really ineffective. So if we can somehow do something about this oracle, if we can somehow even break this oracle, it would be great for logic locking, because then we don't have to worry about output corruption being a problem. So we basically really recently, like 2 weeks ago, there's a paper that came out in TCAD. So the rest of the talk is basically inspired by this paper for the most part. So for more details, again, the pointer is to this paper. So again, what are we trying to do? What we're trying to do is basically, what if we break the oracle? Somehow we get this out of the picture. If we can break the oracle, then the attacker is just left with a locked netlist. So attacker has only the netlist. So obviously this is a weaker attack. And more importantly, output corruption is no longer a concern, because Oracle was the one that's learning from output corruption. And if output corruption is no longer a concern, then we can come up with a very effective logic locking defense if we can somehow break this oracle. How do we break the oracle is the next question. You know, from the movies, there are these nice mechanisms like Cryptex Mechanism from the movie and the book Da Vinci Code. You know, if somebody tries to force this open, there's vinegar in this, and then it will dissolve the special paper that contains the message is destroyed, right? So can we break chips this way? Well, obviously not. I mean, it's difficult to put vinegar in the chips. But there are other things that we could do. So these chips, we know that they have scan chains inside them. And these scan chains are there for those of us who are familiar with testing or debugging. They're there to facilitate high quality test and high quality debug. These are actually flip-flops that are chained together in the scan mode so that we can load them, we can unload them. And the chips, the designs are mainly controlled by these scan cells or scan chains, much more than primary inputs and outputs. So if somebody wanted to access this oracle, this chip, they definitely would want to access the scan chains. Having this in mind, if that is the case, shall we then break the scan chains to break the oracle? That would do the job, but then we really don't want to give away these nice capabilities. We still want to debug chips that fail in field and to understand what went wrong in them. So that's where scan chains are also used. So we really don't want to break the scan chain. It's not a good solution. The next thing that can be done, and in the literature there have been a bunch of solutions called scan locking. So somehow adding additional logic around the scan chains, in between the scan cells and all that. There are a bunch of solutions out there. But these were easy to model. And then again, some version of a SAT solver can eventually be used to break these solutions too. And I put some pointers over here. I can't get into the details, but you know, these are the papers that came out recently. So then what do? We can put some smart active defense on the chip to basically detect these kind of oracle accesses. And basically, there is this special signal called scan-enable signal on every single chip today. And this signal controls the scan chains. Whenever it's one, it means that somebody's loading and unloading the scan chains. So if we can have some sort of a smart active defense on chip that monitors the scan-enable signal, and whenever we see activity on the signal, we can be paranoid and we can say, hey, somebody's trying to attack, somebody's accessing the chip, accessing the oracle. And when that happens, what we can do is we throw the key, we can isolate the key like this, and we throw the key from the rest of the design. And throwing the key in logic locking means pretty much breaking the oracle, because if the key is withdrawn, then the design is controlled by an incorrect key, and then the chip starts giving you wrong results for the inputs that you query it with. So this is the high-level approach that we can take to break the oracle without actually physically breaking the chips. And if this succeeds, and I'll get into the details of this in a few minutes, if this succeeds with a broken oracle, the only thing that the attacker has now is a lock netlist that they're analyzing and trying to figure out the key from the connectivity of this netlist. And so what's the likely attack angle then for the attackers? Well, the attackers can still look for traces on the locked design because, you know, the hope of the attacker is that the defenders may have used CAD tools, which we know are security agnostic. These CAD tools take predictable actions that can be learned by machine learning algorithms or by other smart algorithms, and the attackers can basically leverage this to figure out the key from the locked netlist in the absence of a broken oracle. So we need to keep this in mind when we come up with a logic locking defense solution that will accompany this broken oracle solution, which we call the dishonest oracle solution. So in the dishonest oracle solution, what we're trying to do is we're monitoring the scannable signal, and when an attack is detected, and I say attack in quotation marks, the key is withdrawn, the oracle becomes dishonest right away. So we need to pair this up with a logic locking solution that will give us good output corruption, but at the same time, having the attack angle in mind, this locking approach should be based on some randomized decisions. It should not rely on synthesis tools and the predictable transformations that these tools apply for security guarantees. So let's start with the dishonest oracle solution. So here's the conceptual architecture for the solution. This is the lock design, the inputs, outputs, and the key. And here's a scan chain, and this is the scannable signal. Whenever it's one, as you recall, somebody's loading and unloading. So it's a potentially oracle access. So this simple circuitry over here is a sticky latch. Whenever the scannable signal is one, this sticky latch sticks to a one for the cropped signal. So the cropped signal is set to one and it never goes back to zero unless the chip is reset. So because this signal became a one permanently after this scannable signal went to a one, the lock design is now controlled by a wrong key and not the actual secret key. And then the oracle starts being dishonest. It starts lying. So this is the sticky latch that does it. And this simple mock circuitry conceptually illustrates withdrawing the key operation. The actual implementation is different, and I'll show you in a minute. But the idea is detecting the detecting the access to the oracle, which is a scannable signal, and then acting on it, meaning withdrawing the key. And because we're doing such a drastic, we're taking such a drastic measure based on monitoring of the scannable signal, now there will be implications on test and debug, and we need to talk about that, and we will too. So the actual implementation is through something called a key register that will sit in between the tamper-proof memory and the locked design. So the locked design is expecting the key inputs, the scan chains are over here. The key register is the one that will take in the key and feed this lock design in return. So let's focus on the key register. Let's ignore the lock circuit for now. Let's focus on the key register. It's a simple shift register, as you can see. And what's important about this key register is that it's driven by signals that are already existing in any chip design. So the clock signal, the scannable signal, and the reset are all as existing signals. So we don't need an additional pin or any additional interface. We're not changing the typical test interface of any chip. You see some signals over here called corrupt and corrupt rise, but these signals are generated from the scannable signal and the reset signal. So this is a sticky latch that produces the corrupt signal. Whenever scannable goes to one, corrupt is stuck at one. And this corrupt rise signal is a simple pulse that's generated whenever scannable is set to one for the first time. And the way this works is that after the chip is reset under normal operations, the key will be latched into the key register like this. And then at that point in time, the chip is functional because the correct key is driving the rest of the locked design. But then at any point in time, if the scannable is set to one, then we act paranoid and we say, okay, yeah, this is an attack. So at that point in time, the sticky latch produces a constant 1 signal over here. And more importantly, a pulse is generated on this corrupt rise signal. So 2 things are done. First, this key register is immediately reset. That's what I refer to as withdrawing the key. So the key is immediately reset. And also, because corrupt is permanently 1 now, permanently until the chip is reset, it's 1 now, the key register stops looking at the tamper-proof memory. It's effectively disconnected from the tamper-proof memory. So the key is now truly isolated from the rest of the design the minute somebody plays with the scan-able signal. And from that point on, you know, the user of the chip, whether it's a legitimate user, whether it's an attacker, they could do whatever they want with the key register, but they will be controlling their own values. They will be loading their own values, whatever they are, dummy values, without knowing the actual key. So to summarize, whenever somebody plays with the scan-able signal, the key register is immediately reset. It's disconnected from the tamper-proof memory, erasing the traces of the key immediately. So effectively with this solution, what ends up happening is the chip works in 2 different modes. There's a secure region where upon reset, so long as the scan-able signal is 0, nobody plays with the scan-able signal, the chip works normally with the correct key in place, and the chip works functionally. It's functional. It produces expected results. But the minute somebody sets the scan-able signal, then the chip moves into this insecure region. At that point, right before that happens, the key is cleared. In this mode, the user is free to load whatever values they want into the key register. But the key is withdrawn in this region. So, and as you can see, there is no transition back into the secure region from the insecure region. The only way to get back here is to reset the whole chip, to do a power up of the chip to get back into the secure region. So now let's talk about testing and debugging, because we're really doing things that are kind of drastic in terms of activities on the scan-able signal. Because scan-able signal is also used legitimately for testing purposes. It's that, scan-able equals 1 does not necessarily mean an attack. We were just too paranoid. So what's the effect on testing? Well, the good news is that when you're testing a circuitry, especially for structural things, structural defects, you go after faults, you really do not need the chip to be functional. In fact, when we perform tests of chips today, people use test points everywhere around the chip, and the ATPG tool is free to configure these test points. And when it does so, the chip is, not functional, because test points, when they're configured into certain values, that doesn't reflect reality. So there's nothing different going on over here either. These key register flip-flops are now acting like test points. And the minute we withdraw the key from the rest of the design, yes, the chip becomes dishonest or not functional, but the ATPG tool is free to load any values into these key registers, whatever is best to maximize the fault coverage, whatever is best to minimize the test pattern count. So ATPG decides what to load in these key registers. And the other nice outcome of this is that because during test, whenever scan-able signal is set, the key is isolated, and because during ATPG, there is no information about the keys, so the test pattern generated has no idea about the actual secret key. Chips that are already activated can actually be safely sent to untrusted OSAT facilities for testing. No problem. So we can load the correct key on a chip, and then we can ship it out to a test facility, because the minute they set the scan-able signal, the key is going to protect itself. This is a solution that kind of contradicts with the recent finding that suggests that you should always test chips before they're activated, because it's not safe. In this scheme, it is safe. The testing happens in this insecure region, obviously, because scan enable signal is 1, and then that's how we perform shift operations, and then you could do capture operations over here. But the values that are shifted into the key register during the testing process are values identified by the ATPG tool, whatever is best for fault coverage per pattern. The other question, so that's test. The other question is in-field debug. So in-field debug is a little different than testing, because now some chip failed in-field, and you really want to expose the bug, and you really want the chip to be functional this time, as opposed to testing. You want the chip to be functional. At the same time, you want to be able to use the scan chain. So you are going to play around with the scan enable signal. So how do you do it? Obviously, the minute you set the scan enable signal, the key is withdrawn. So the only way to do debug in this kind of a setting is basically by sending the chips that will be debugged to a trusted facility, to a facility where the key, the secret key, is known. And the secret key this time is to be loaded through the scanner interface, not through the tamper-proof memory into the scan chains, but into the key register, but through the scan interface into the key register. The key is to be loaded serially, and when the correct key is in place, then the chip is functional, and then in this insecure mode, we can still perform our multiple shifts to bring in a desired state, and then multiple functional cycles, and then multiple unload operations with the correct key in place. Again, this time the key comes in through the scanner interface and not through the tamper-proof memory. So that's the way to perform proper functional debugging. So with this solution in mind, what have we accomplished? So this solution deals with the Oracle-based attacks, because we are now effectively breaking the Oracle. So this means that we can safely eliminate the attacks that rely on an Oracle access. And then there are a bunch of other attacks. By the way, we also can eliminate this one too, because this also needs Oracle access. There are a bunch of other attacks that targeted some of the recent SAT resilient solutions too. They are technique specific, so we can eliminate them as well. There are still a bunch of other attacks like these ones that only look at the locked netlist. They don't require an Oracle. So we need to just keep in our minds about, you know, these attacks, how they work. So we need to come up with a logic locking defense that will accompany this dishonest Oracle solution to not only give high corruptibility, like one of these solutions over here, they all give really good output corruption, but at the same time, we need to keep in mind these Oracle-less attack solutions, such as these two that remain over here. So how to pick that companion for the dishonest Oracle? What kind of a logic locking defense should we have in mind to get good output corruption, but at the same time be resilient against those Oracle-less attacks that just analyze the netlist and make decisions? So let's go back to the basics of logic locking, because really we are revisiting the very first logic locking solutions that give us good output corruption. XOR gates are great to give us good error propagation. That's what they have. That's the features that they have. They could propagate errors nicely. But what we know is that XOR, when we insert an XOR gate into a design for logic locking purposes, to preserve the functionality, the key must be 0. And if it's an XNOR gate that we're inserting to lock a design, to preserve the functionality of the original design, the key must be 1. And this is not something good, because now the gate type XOR versus XNOR is now implying what the secret key value must be. So if it's an XOR, it must be 0. If it's an XNOR, it must be 1. This is not good, because whoever is analyzing the netlist can just say, oh, this is an XOR, so the key value must be 0. This is an XNOR, the key value must be 1. So we have to do something about it. And what people have been doing is that they're using the bubble pushing feature, or this kind of a synthesis transformation scheme to break the inference between the key gate type, and the key value. So say you insert this XOR gate over here, normally the value is going to be 0 to preserve the functionality. What you do is you do some bubble pushing, you change the gate types over here, you add a bubble and inverter over here, just for the sake of retaining the value of 0 over here and yet having an XNOR gate this time. Okay, so now we have an XNOR gate, but driven by 0. And here it's an XOR gate driven by 0. So with this, you can introduce some sort of an ambiguity for reverse engineers. It's no longer key gates inferring the value of the key bit. And the problem with this, though, is that you're kind of relying on some synthesis transformations. You're relying on synthesis tools to apply these transformations. And these are predictable transformations that the attacks can learn. And there have been attacks in exactly doing that, such as the SAIL attack. So this is something to keep in mind. This is something to not do, not rely on synthesis tools or any transformations they apply. And the random logic locking, even the R stands for, even though the R stands for random, it's not truly random because it relies on these kind of transformations. It only chooses the locations of these XOR or XNOR gates randomly. Otherwise, there are many, not so random, quite predictable transformations going on over here. So how do we come up with a truly random logic locking solution that still gives high output corruptibility, but at the same time makes some sort of randomized decision without relying on transformations of synthesis tools for security guarantees, right? And that's exactly what this technique that I'll show you is to do. So here you have the original design, and here you have the lock design. Now, in the original design here on this net, there's no inverter, but here there's an inverter. So when you make decisions for this case, when there's no inverter, you basically toss a coin. And then depending on the outcome of this coin toss, you either insert an XNOR over here, which means the key must be 1, or you insert an XOR gate over here, which means the key must be 0. This is something that we already discussed. But in the other case, where you have an inverter on this net, what you do is you again do a coin toss, and then you either replace this inverter by an XNOR gate, or you replace this inverter by an XOR gate, okay? In the first case, key is 0, and in the second case, key is 1. This is good because when somebody is analyzing the locked netlist, as part of our threat model now, this is the only thing that the attacker has, the locked netlist. When they see this XNOR gate, they will not be able to infer the value of this key bit because it could be 0 or it could be a 1. It really depends on whether this XNOR gate replaced any existing inverter in the design or if it was just inserted on a net with no inverter. And the decisions have been based on coin tosses. So we are effectively telling the attacker to predict the outcome of the coin tosses, which by definition is random guessing. So with this kind of an approach, there is no inference of the key value from the key gate types because it could be anything, 0 or 1, 0 or 1. And there is no bubble pushing needed. There is no transformations that this scheme relies on. There's no synthesis tool features that this scheme relies on. It's a very simple standalone tool that can do this based on some randomized decisions. And that's why we call this, because it's based on randomized decisions, we call it truly random logic locking. So let me go through the rest of this very quickly. If you put these two schemes together, dishonest oracle and truly random logic locking, you get great output corruption. You're resilient against all the oracle-based and oracle-less attacks. And as a result, you can protect yourself, your chip design against all these possibly untrusted stages of the manufacturing flow. We ran basic experiments where we showed that when you apply the redundancy attack, one of the promising oracle-less attacks, it performs no better than random guessing. When you implement this to see what the cost is like, both truly random logic locking plus the dishonest oracle, and if you just focus on your attention on the largest circuit, you see that the area and power is really around 1%. And if you do this on a really large design, we expect these numbers to go way down. So it's a really cost-effective solution too. In terms of impact on testing, as expected, the fault coverage is expected to be great because key register is now acting like test points. There is some impact on test data volume because now you need to shift in values into the key register as part of every one of your ATPG patterns. So it goes up just a little bit. But again, if you work with a real chip design, industry level chip design, where you have millions of bits in every ATPG pattern, and you're only talking about 100, 200 qubits per pattern, this will be a very small percentage. So to summarize, logic locking is a really good holistic defense that can protect you against a bunch of problems, such as control over supply chain and thus overbuilding. You can hide functionality of your chip design. You can protect yourself against reverse engineering and IP piracy, as long as the logic locking defense is a meaningful one, meaning it should be effective, as long as it's a resilient one, meaning if somebody attacks to get the key, they can't. Oracles have been a problem that the community has been dealing with. That's why there's this dishonest Oracle solution that we recently proposed to eliminate these Oracle guided attacks. And when you pair it with a solution that gives you both good corruptibility and also based on truly randomized decisions, you give no opportunity to attacks that are based on learning. So these two make a good pair in terms of a good logic locking defense. And then we get good protection against the fab, the testing facility, and also the end users. Here are some references in case people are interested to look at the green defense papers and the red attack papers. This is our website where we have various videos on logic locking, where we have material in case you want to try out different attacks. We actually have actual locked chip designs over there that you can access and play around with. There are a bunch of patents, both accepted and pending, and there's this reference book, as well as this very recently published paper, like a couple of weeks ago, that you can look at. It's a TCAD paper. Just search for Dishonest Oracle. And with that, I conclude my talk. I'm ready to take questions. And if somebody comes up with a question after today, they can always email me. I'll do my best to get back as quickly as I can. Thank you for your attention.
Great, thank you so much. So the first question is, do all attacks require the scan enable signal to be high? In other words, can an attack be launched without enabling the scan chain?
So attacks, yes, there could be attacks without using the scan chain. But in that case, when you don't use the scan chains, scan chains control most of the design. The minute the scan chains are out of the picture, you really have minimal control and controlling and observing capabilities for the chip. And that's why the community shifted from non-scan designs to full scan designs 30, 40, 50 years ago. So the attack effectiveness will be quite limited the minute scan chains are out of the picture. The paper that I mentioned, where we talk more about the implementation details and so on, elaborates more on this issue. There are actually some experimental results to answer that question in a quantitative manner too.
Thank you. The next question is, where do we see logic locking in real circuits/applications?
Logic locking has been an academic practice for the most part up until today, with the exception that one of the EDA vendors, I think Mentor Graphics, is enabling logic locking as part of their tool flow. There's one solution out there. Its resilience is highly questionable because the threat models that they assume are quite different. But in that sense, it's not widely adopted out there yet. The logic locking solutions. There are active efforts, mostly driven by DARPA, to turn these solutions into fully automated solutions. The DARPA ACE program is in particular trying to do that. We're part of that program too, for the sake of coming up with automated solutions that the industry can adopt and use. But at this point in time, to the best of our knowledge, not too many chip design companies are using logic locking.
So the next question is, how can the programmed key be protected against physical attacks?
So physical attacks, in the sense that there could be, one attempt could be, and there have been a couple of papers on this, trying to probe live signals on the chip. These are really difficult to implement and realize attacks. In reality, given that the transistor sizes are shrinking, it's becoming more and more difficult. But there are also, if it is a concern indeed, there are easy, quite simple countermeasures like special packaging-based solutions that could be utilized to protect the chip from such probing-based physical attacks. So there have been a couple of papers, I think one by Mark's group, one by Christopher Parr's group, about these kind of attacks, but also there's a solution, this simple countermeasure by, again, Mark Tehranipour's group, talking about how a simple countermeasure can thwart these kind of attacks.
Great, so the next question is, how can the programmed key be protected? Oh wait, sorry. Is there a possibility of having functional equivalent simulators for the hardware design? In this case, even if the Oracle is disabled, we can use the simulator to get the expected behavior. Is that possible?
Could you repeat the question? I couldn't parse it in my mind.
Yes, no worries. Is there a possibility of having functional equivalent simulators for the hardware design? And in this case, even if the Oracle is disabled, we can use the simulator to get the expected behavior. Is this possible?
It's an interesting question. So, the whole defense angle that we took was to kill that Oracle. And the question is whether that Oracle can be reconstructed somehow. I can't see a way how that can be done. It may be possible, but I honestly can't see how that can be done. How do you gather all the information? Because we're talking about millions, chips with millions of flip-flops. How do you gather all that information? Where do you gather them from? If you don't have working chips out there, I honestly don't think it's doable. But if somebody can figure it out, they can of course write a paper.
Great, thank you so much. That is it for the questions. So thank you everyone for attending the MEST Center webinar. And if you look at the chat feature, I will send a survey link and we would love to hear your feedback on the MEST Center webinars. So I'd appreciate if you took just a couple of minutes to answer this 4-question survey. The next MEST Center webinar is on November 4th, and I hope to see everyone there. So have a great day and stay safe, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks, Özger.